Hello everybody. Today we're going to be discussing the nervous system. Just to recap with what we've already discussed with the support systems of the body and homeostasis, I wanted to review that homeostasis is the body's way of maintaining a constant and balanced internal state despite what is going on externally and internally in terms of environments. The nervous system is a great system to kind of apply this concept of homeostasis, as we'll discuss a little later on in this presentation. The primary structures of the nervous system are the brain, spinal cord, and nerves. In the next couple slides, we're going to be discussing the different divisions of the nervous system because it's broken into many smaller groups. The primary functions of the system are to recognize and coordinate responses to changes in internal and external environments. Why does this sound familiar? Because it's almost the same as homeostasis. If you remember from the feedback loop, the control center where the response is made, that is what the nervous system does. The nervous system and the endocrine system, we're not going to really get into the endocrine system, but I want you guys to know that the endocrine system is hormones. So you have neurobiological stimuli and responses, but you also have hormonal stimuli, which are through the different glands in your body that are through the endocrine system. I believe in our applications on the nervous system PowerPoint, there are a couple slides on the endocrine system. You're not going to be responsible for knowing the endocrine system for the unit, but I do want you guys to understand the concept of the endocrine system and be able to relate it to the nervous system. Next is the neuron. If you remember when we discussed tissues, I said the nervous tissue was also called a neuron. Well, this is a neuron. Its function is to transmit nerve impulses. There are different parts of the neuron, and you will be responsible for knowing these. You have the axon terminals, which are the transmitters. You have the axon, or the conducting fiber, and I'm sorry that that link keeps showing up. You have the myelin sheath, which is the insulating fatty layer of the neuron, which speeds up transmission. You have the node of Ranvier, which is right here, which is the space between the myelin sheath. You have the Schwann cells, which make up the myelin. So it's the little dots on the myelin sheath. Then you have the nucleus, which if you remember from cells are the basic units of kind of the brain of the cell. You have the cell body, and then you have the dendrites, which are the receivers of the impulse. These are the dendrites up here. So that is the structure of a neuron. We're going to be working a lot with the neuron and the brain, but I do want you guys to take a minute to write down each part of the neuron because you will be responsible for knowing what they do and where they are in the neuron. So I'll give you a couple seconds. Okay. Like I said earlier, the nervous system is divided into many divisions. The most basic systemic division is between central and peripheral nervous system. And basically what that means is through structure. The central nervous system consists of the brain and the spinal cord, where the peripheral nervous system consists of nerves. The central nervous system, like I said, contains the brain. Here's a picture of the brain and the different lobes and parts of the brain. It doesn't consist all of the parts you will need to know, but there's a picture that's a little less colorful and enjoyable to look at on the next slide that will help you guys to see the different parts that you will be responsible for knowing. But there are 4 lobes of the brain. They're also called the cerebrum. And within the cerebrum the cerebrum is basically the brain itself. There are 4 lobes, a parietal, frontal, temporal, and occipital. And later on we're going to get into the function of each of the lobes and the parts of the brain, which you will be responsible for. And here's a nice colorful picture to hopefully smooth out any confusion on where the arrows are pointing or where the different parts of the brain are. Like I said, we will be getting into the functions of these parts of the brain. The nervous system is probably the one system we go the most in depth on because you can apply the knowledge of the nervous system to the other systems, and the nervous system works so cohesively with homeostasis, which is the overlying theme of anatomy, which is what this unit is, human physiology or anatomy. Like I said, here's the less appealing picture to look at, but this is the exact same picture you're going to be getting on quizzes, on tests, I'm not positive if it's on your final, but here's the picture of the brain. And here are the parts that you're going to need to know. You have the lobes, the corpus callosum, the cerebrum, the cerebellum, medulla oblongata, pituitary gland. Interesting fact, pituitary gland, even though it's part of the brain, it is not part of the nervous system. It is a part of the endocrine system. But it is a part of the brain. So technically it's kind of a double whammy. It works for both systems, but it is a endocrine gland. The function of the parts of the body. You have the cerebrum, which is primarily function is to control voluntary and conscious activities. It consists of the lobes of the brain, the frontal, occipital, parietal, and temporal. Frontal lobe is primarily functioned as reasoning, judgment, emotions, and voluntary movement. The occipital lobe is vision. Parietal lobe, sensory receptors, reading and speech. And temporal lobe is hearing, smell, and memory. Moving down the list, you have the cerebellum. Be very careful not to confuse cerebrum and cerebellum. They're very similar, but they're very different. The cerebellum is a little pom-pom ball at the back of the brain. I'll go back to the picture. Right here is the cerebellum. But its primary function is balance, posture, movement, and muscle coordination. Next, you have the spinal cord, which is nerve fibers running from the base of the brain to the hip area through the spine. We're going to be focusing in on the spinal cord when we get into the peripheral nervous system and when we start talking about reflexes. Next is the brainstem, which coordinates vital life functions such as blood pressure, heart rate, breathing, and swallowing. If something happens to your brainstem, chances are you're going to die. Next is the medulla oblongata, which is automatic functions such as heartbeat and breathing. Next is the corpus callosum, which is the communication between the hemispheres of the brain. The brain is split into two hemispheres, right and left, and the corpus callosum is the communication between the two. The pons is the connection between the two, and is also responsible for arousal and sleep. Throughout this unit, you're going to have to write a paper on sleep, so be sure to include something about the pons, because its primary function is sleep. And finally, there's the pituitary gland, which is hormone secretion. Hormones are part of the endocrine system, so even though this is part of the brain, it is an endocrine gland, as I said earlier. Moving right along to the peripheral nervous system, also called the PNS. That is broken into many parts, starting with sensory versus motor division. The sensory division transmits impulses from sense organs to the central nervous system, so touch, smell, taste, to the brain and to the spinal cord. The motor division transmits impulses from the central nervous system to the muscles and glands. In your notes, I want you to write down how you think sensory and motor division of the peripheral nervous system relates to a homeostatic feedback loop. I'll give you about 5 seconds to do that. Okay. So going down even further within the motor division, we have the somatic nervous system. And that consists of voluntary control and reflex arcs. Voluntary control are impulses originating from the brain, where reflex arcs are automatic rapid responses, typically in painful scenarios. So like I mentioned in a screencast earlier, if you were touching a hot stove when we were discussing the skin and your sensory receptors, a reflex arc is going to be used to move your hand away. If it went to your brain from your hand, it would take too long and too much damage would happen. The purpose of reflex arcs are to give an automatic response to allow the stimulus to be slowed or stopped, so for you to move your hand away before too much damage occurs. And then later on, you'll have already moved your hand before your brain receives the message and says, ow, you just touched a hot stove. Continuing on with the PNS with a reflex arc. I've been talking about this so much within these first couple presentations, but here's the reflex arc. The purpose is to respond to stimuli. If you remember it as SAME, sensory association motor and effector. The sensory receptor detects the stimulus. Sensory neuron relays the information to the spinal cord. The association or interneuron processes the information and formulates a response. The motor neuron carries the response, and the effector neuron responds to the impulse, or responds to the stimulus. And the response is performed, and the impulse is then carried to the brain for you to kind of get the feeling of it. You put your hand on a hot stove, a reflex arc is going to cause you to remove your hand from the stove before your brain even knows it happened. That's because of the sensory receptors in your hand are going to your spinal cord. If you think about it, if it's from your hand going all the way up your spinal cord to your brain, by that time too much damage has happened, and it could cause a lot of pain and a lot of damage to your body because of that. That's the purpose of reflex arcs, to respond to stimuli quickly and effectively. So just remember SAME, sensory association motor effector. In class, we're going to be doing a demonstration of nerve impulses. We're going to create a stimulus, and we'll get into this in class. But each student's going to create a stimulus. You could do this with a couple friends if you wanted. So you're going to create a stimulus or a signal to the person next to get the person next to you's attention, like tapping their shoulder. You're going to pass a note from one person to the next. The note is the nerve impulse, the signal is the shoulder tapping, and then the signal, the shoulder tapping, is the stimulus, and then taking the note would be the response. So based on this demonstration, even though we didn't do it yet, I want you to write in your notes how you think, how each of these, like the note, how is it the nerve impulse, how is the shoulder tapping a stimulus, and how is the note a response. And I want you to create a feedback loop based on this little activity. Okay, moving on. The autonomic nervous system is the regulation of involuntary activities. So when you run, your heart rate and blood flow speed up. The autonomic nervous system is composed of two systems, the sympathetic nervous system and the parasympathetic nervous system. You've probably heard of the expression fight or flight. That's with the sympathetic nervous system. That's when you're in a scenario, your blood pressure will rise and your heart rate will rise, where rest and digest is when your blood pressure and your heart rate will go down. Not to the point where you're going to die, but to respond to an action or a stimulus. So just remember, fight or flight is a sympathetic, parasympathetic is rest and digest. A little way to remember this: sympathetic is a smaller word than parasympathetic. Parasympathetic takes you longer to say, so you're resting, or you're not really resting to say the word, but it takes you longer to say it. Fight or flight is a quick response, sympathetic smaller than parasympathetic. I hope that little connection helps. If not, just remember sympathetic fight or flight, parasympathetic rest and digest. Alright. So that is the end of the nervous system notes. In the next screencast, it's going to be some applications on the nervous system, on sleep and addiction, and briefly touching upon the endocrine system. Again, if you have questions, feel free to email me, or you could email Ms. Rayner if you choose. We will be working on a reflex lab later on in the week. Have a great day, and adios, amigos. Ciao.